You said. Daphne decides to save Electra and Will's relationship by returning the letter to them. Daphne Rose sat in her satiny, sun-drenched apartment, the crumpled letter gripped tightly in her hands, feeling a heaviness that pressed down on her casket, a combination of dread, responsibility, and determination. She had spent the once several hours replaying the moment she discovered Ivy's manipulations over and over in her mind, how Electra, so vulnerable and trusting, had been led amiss, and how Will, blindsided by Ivy's designing, had nearly made a mistake that could shatter his heart ever. The study of their love, pure and long-standing despite every handicap, being derailed by dishonesty eroded at her heart, and Daphne knew she couldn't remain silent. Her fritters quivered slightly as she smoothed out the letter, reading Ivy's precisely drafted falsehoods formerly more, each word a dagger aimed at the bond between Will and Electra. She recalled the hurt in Electra's eyes when she had confessed some of her dubieties, the confusion and anguish Will had displayed when he'd brazened the hints of treason, and she felt a nearly motherly appetite to step by, to shield them from heartache. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Daphne imagined the moment she'd return the letter to Electra, knowing it could enkindle wrathfulness, shock and gashes but also honesty and conciliation. As she approached Forrester Creations, the bustling energy of the fashion house sounded nearly trivial compared to the storm of feelings swirling inside her. She set up Electra in the design room, sketchbook abandoned on the table as she tossed with a pencil, her posture stiff with pressure. Electra, Daphne began vocally, her voice gentle but firm. There's commodity you need to see, commodity you need to know before it's too late. Electra looked up, eyebrows furrowed, curiosity mixed with an implied fear in her aspect. Daphne handed over the letter, their fritters brushing compactly, and Electra's hands shook as she unfolded the paper, surveying the words that had caused so important confusion, so important pain. I do'n't understand, Electra rumored, her voice jiggling, eyes wide with unbelief. Daphne took a conservative step closer, placing a reassuring hand on Electra's shoulder. I know it's hard and it's going to hurt, but this is the verity, she said, her eyes locking with Electra's, conveying sincerity and care. Across the room, Will, who had been staying nervously in the conterminous office, caught sight of Electra's expression and set, heart pounding, artificially knowing that the moment of disclosure had arrived. The pressure was palpable, the air thick with expectation, as Electra eventually met Will's aspect. Gashes brimming, a admixture of relief and moping hurt in her eyes. Will, he prevaricated to us both, she muttered, her voice slightly audible, and Will's jaw tensed as he took a careful step forward, reaching for her hand. Electra, I swear I know way, he began, but Daphne gently fitted. Let him finish, but hear the whole verity first. Ivy's been manipulating everything. You need to know what really happened without any falsehoods in the way. The weight of her words hung in the room, an unnoticeable ground of honesty connecting the three of them as Electra's fritters tensed around the letter, the paper pulsing in her grip. Sluggishly, sorrowfully, she began to read audibly crucial passages, breaking, choking back gashes, but each word cleared down the fog of deception, revealing the stark discrepancy between Ivy's manipulation and the genuine love she and Will participated. Will's eyes softened as he heeded, anguish transubstantiating into understanding, guilt for the confusion he'd felt dissolving into renewed commitment. Daphne, watching them, felt a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't about her, it was about saving a love she knew was worth fighting for. As Electra reached the end of the letter, her eyes glistering with gashes, she turned to Will, her voice breaking but determined. I still love you, but we need to rebuild. From then together, no further secrets. Will's response was immediate, belting his arms around her in a tender grasp, a silent pledge that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Daphne stepped back, a small, nearly inappreciable smile on her face, heart swelling with relief as she witnessed the fragile, beautiful reconnection she had helped spark. Outdoors, the hum of Los Angeles life continued as if nothing had happened, but inside the walls of Forrester Creations, commodity monumental had shifted. A love tested by falsehoods, now strengthened by verity, a bond renewed, and a sense of stopgap rising for a couple who had been on the point of heartache. Daphne's part, quiet yet pivotal, remained her secret palm. She knew that occasionally the bold act wasn't battle or drama, but simply being the runner of verity at the right moment. As Electra and Will held each other, a renewed energy sounded to palpitate through the room, and Daphne still slipped down, leaving them to heal, to forgive, and to love formerly more, knowing that in the world of Forrester fashion, amid schemes and intentions, the purest palms were frequently unnoticeable to everyone except those who watched enough to act. Daphne dallied just outside the design room, her heart still contending from the battle she had orchestrated, feeling the residual weight of responsibility press against her casket like a living thing. She had set the stage for honesty, but she knew that verity frequently came with consequences far heavier than the original relief, and she could nearly hear the reverberations of the lives she had touched echoing down the hallways of Forrester Creations. Outside, Electra held the letter as if it were a lifeline, her eyes surveying the essence-stained paper, tracing each deceitful word Ivy had penned, every manipulative expression designed to pull her in will piecemeal, and with each line, a new subcast of clarity settled over her such like sun breaking through storm shadows. Yet the sting of treason dallied, a bitter memorial that the people we trust most occasionally apply power we no way imagined, and she could feel an earthquake of wrathfulness, frustration, and sadness battling against the love she still felt for Will. Will, standing just a many bases down, had his hands approximately clasped, a admixture of expectation and fear in his eyes, as if every second he awaited to hear Electra's response was a measure of his own worthiness, and he allowed back to the moments he'd felt lost and manipulated, wishing he could rewind time, undo the misconstructions, and abolish the guilt that had crept into his heart like a shadow. Daphne, watching them both, felt a swell of determination. She had been the quiet protection, the unseen hand guiding them back toward the path of verity, and now she quietly prompted them forward, willing them to face the love that had endured despite designing and lies. Electra's voice quivered as she eventually looked up from the letter, gashes hanging to slip, and she met Will's aspect with a raw honesty that left him shortly breathless. I can't believe Ivy did this to us, she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. All the dubieties, the confusion, and yet, I know I still love you. Will stepped closer, reaching out with hands that shook slightly, wanting to console her, wanting to bridge the gap that had been widened by dishonesty, and he rumored, Electra, I swear, none of it was real between us. My heart has always been yours. Indeed, when I didn't understand the games that were being played. Daphne felt a stitch of satisfaction at his words, yet she knew their trip was over. Trust, formerly shaken, needed further than bare affirmations. It demanded tolerance, empathy, and the amenability to defy the murk that dallied. As Electra pressed the letter against her casket, her mind contended with studies of what had been, what could have been, and what would be if they allowed themselves to rebuild their bond. The office sounded to fade around them, the hum of printers and chatter of sidekicks getting background noise to the profound intensity of the moment, and for a suspended moment, nothing was beyond the fragile yet flexible connection between two people who had endured manipulation, heartache, and query. Daphne still excused herself, stepping back into the hallway, letting the couple have their space to reuse, heal, and recommit, all the while reflecting on the delicate balance she had maintained between intervention and overreach. She understood that her part was that of a companion, not a rescuer, and that true conciliation would come from within them, forged in their amenability to defy pain and grasp remission. Meanwhile, away in the structure, Ivy paced nervously in her satiny apartment overlooking the megacity, ignorant that her strictly constructed web of dishonesty had begun to unravel, her mind contending with possible explanations, defenses, and schemes to recapture control, and she felt the faint prickling sensation of dubitation creeping along her chine, and spontaneous warning that the walls of manipulation she had erected were starting to deteriorate. Across City Ridge, Forrester, having caught wind of the subtle pressure between Electra and Will, walked through the sunlit corridors of the Forrester Creations headquarters, reflecting on the fragile state of his family, the implacable dynamics of love, fidelity, and treason playing out like an intricate fashion show of feelings, and he set up himself both cautious and hopeful, understanding that the connections between people, whether by blood, love, or choice, were frequently tested, most roughly in moments like these. Back in the design room, Electra eventually let herself rest against Will, their facades touching in a tender gesture of consolation, and as they sluggishly embraced, the raw vulnerability of the moment allowed them to begin rebuilding not only trust but the closeness that had been strained by falsehoods, while Daphne, watching from a discreet distance, felt the satisfaction of her intervention settle like a quiet palm, one that was impalpable yet profoundly meaningful, a testament to the unseen hands that occasionally guided fortune without fanfare or recognition. Indeed, as they held each other, Electra's mind flitted to the ineluctable exchanges with family members, the fallout that Ivy's designing might provoke, and the particular reflections that would need to be faced in the days ahead. She knew that the road to full mending would not be immediate, that remission needed trouble and commitment, yet in that moment, the sheer relief of honesty and reconnection allowed her to breathe freely, to flash back why her love for Will had endured, and to imagine a unborn untainted by deception. Will, feeling her palpitation, her warmth and her presence, allowed himself to release the pressure he'd carried, admitting the miscalculations, misconstructions and manipulations that had kept them piecemeal, and in that silent acknowledgement, a renewed strength surfaced within him, a resoluteness to cover their love, nurture it, and guard it against the kind of duplicity that had hovered to destroy it. Daphne, stepping further down, contemplated the subtle power of timing, the significance of courage in choosing verity over silence, and the delicate art of knowing when to act and when to allow others the space to heal, realizing that in the shade of mortal connections, moments like these, fraught with pressure, emotion and moral choices were the vestments that defined the strength and beauty of bonds that could endure any trial. Daphne Rose dallied quietly just outside the design room, the faint echo of her own twinkle mingling with the distant hum of Forrester Creations' bustling services, her triumph still warm from the crumpled letter she had delivered moments before, and she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing against her like an unnoticeable force. She had set in stir a chain of events that could either heal a shattered relationship or consolidate its injuries, and though she had no desire for recognition, a quiet part of her felt the exhilaration of being the unseen guardian of commodity precious, of guiding Electra and Will back to each other before Ivy's manipulations could do endless damage. Outside, Electra gripped the letter against her casket, her fritters pulsing as she reread Ivy's deceitful words, the deliberate falsehoods meant to drive a wedge between her and Will, and with every line, her mind reeled, cycling through unbelief, wrathfulness, treason, and a nearly spontaneous hankering to forgive, to hold on to the love that had endured so important formerly. She could feel the sting of manipulation burn sprucely, a bitter taste she could end fluently wash down. Yet beneath it all was a patient palpitation of stopgap, the recognition that Will had been caught in the deception just as important as she had, and that their bond might be flexible enough to survive indeed this. Will stood a many way down, his hands approximately clasped, the pressure in his body a glass of the fermentation raging within Electra, as recollections of his own confusion and helplessness swamped back. The nights he'd lain awake, tortured by Ivy's imputations, wondering if Electra had begun to misdoubt him, questioning whether his love had been enough to shield them both from the cunning schemes of someone who had grown dangerously close to their lives. Now brazened with the inarguable verity in Electra's pulsing hands, he felt an inviting admixture of relief, guilt and renewed determination, his casket tensing as he fought back gashes he hadn't allowed himself in weeks. Daphne's eyes softened as she watched them, acutely apprehensive that her part was delicate, nearly unnoticeable. She couldn't mandate their passions, couldn't magically abolish the confusion and hurt Ivy had sown, but she could produce the conditions for honesty to flourish, for love to reclaim its place in the room, and she felt a quiet triumph knowing that the moment of reckoning had arrived, that the letter was no longer an armament but a catalyst for clarity, understanding, and maybe conciliation. Electra's voice trilled as she eventually looked up, her aspect locking with Will's, raw vulnerability shining through the gash-oiled cheeks. I do'n't know how to make sense of all of this. I trusted and I was deceived, and now I still love you, but I do'n't know how to move forward without fear moping in my casket. Will stepped closer, closing the gap with careful perfection, his hands reaching for hers, his tone steady, gentle yet hot. Electra, you do'n't have to move forward alone. I've always been then. I've no way stopped loving you. And I swear from this moment forward, honesty will guide us. No more secrets. No more games. Only us. Electra's pulsing hands pressed against his, seeking the warmth and consolation that had always defined their connection, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a reluctant exhale, the sharp edges of treason dulling slightly under the defensive cocoon of Will's presence. Daphne, standing slightly back, let a quiet smile slip across her lips, though she knew this palm was only partial. The fate of disclosure was infrequently tidy, and while verity had cleared the fog Ivy had created, rebuilding trust, restoring faith in one another, and navigating the unfaithful waters of moping mistrustfulness would take tolerance, adaptability, and collective commitment that had yet to be tested. Meanwhile, away in the structure, Ridge Forrester walked through the sunlit hallways, his eyes catching subtle expressions on the faces of staff who tasted, without knowing completely, the emotional earthquake that had just shaken the design room. Ridge's instincts, honed by decades of navigating the turbulent waters of his own family's love, treason, and ambition, told him commodity critical had passed, though the details were obscured, and he felt a admixture of defensive anxiety and conservative curiosity, wondering whether he should intermediate or allow the youthful couple to navigate this fragile moment singly. Brooke Logan, passing by with her ever-present grace and motherly sapience, broke amid-step. Seeing the pressure radiating from the glass-paneled office, her mind incontinently jumping to worst-case scripts, Ivy's manipulation, the eventuality for lasting damage, and the subtle but unmistakable signs that love, indeed when genuine, needed careful tending lest the history's murk reassert themselves. Inside the room, Electra eventually set the letter down on the polished office, her fritters moping on the crumpled edges, an emblematic gesture of releasing the weight of dishonesty while still admitting its impact. She took a slow, deliberate breath, turning to Will with a blend of vulnerability and defiance. Weave to rebuild, Will. Not just pretend nothing happened, but truly rebuild moment by moment, word by word. Can we do that? Will's response was immediate, his expression a blend of determination and tender-heartedness. Electra, with every fiber of my being, yes. We'll defy the falsehoods, face the dubieties, and grow stronger. Whatever it takes, I'm with you. Daphne's eyes glistered with quiet satisfaction as she observed this conditional conciliation, knowing that her choice to return the letter had shifted the balance, yet apprehensive that Ivy's influence was entirely extinguished. Nearly, Ivy was colluding, conniving, trying to find cracks in the newfound honesty, and Daphne felt the motions of caution, ready to intermediate should the need arise. Across city, Ivy's apartment overlooked the shimmering megacity lights, her fritters twisting in restless agitation, her mind spinning through scripts, defenses, and manipulations, desperately trying to recapture control, yet seeing a creeping mindfulness that her power over Will and Electra had been compromised, that the careful edifice she had erected with perfection and cunning was beginning to deteriorate in the face of genuine love and translucency, and for the first time, flicker of mistrustfulness, fear, and vulnerability pierced the armor she had cultivated for times. Back at Forrester Creations, the emotional meter between Electra and Will began to shift, subtle yet inarguable. Small gestures, a nearly inappreciable squeeze of the hand, a participated regard, a conditional smile, gestured the onsets of trust being rebuilt, each moment a slip-up in the fragile yet promising foundation of conciliation, and Daphne observed with a blend of pride and stopgap, completely apprehensive that the most delicate palms frequently went unseen, unnoticed by the world, yet held immense significance for those directly involved. The day stretched onward, the hum of printers, phones, and fashion staff forming a steady background to the private drama unfolding in the design room, a poignant memorial that life continued around them indeed as their particular world had shifted irrevocably. Electra and Will, though still recycling the exposures and injuries foisted by deception, leaned into one another, participating quiet moments of reflection, vulnerability, and conditional connection, while Daphne remained watchful, understanding that love restored was fragile, and that honesty, courage, and timing would determine whether it flourished or faltered under the ineluctable pressures of family, business, and moping secrets. Ridge, seeing the subtle pressure and emotional graveness expiring from the design room, changed a knowing regard with Brooke, who had broke to observe the subtle dynamics from a distance, both apprehensive that what was passing between Electra and Will was further than a particular conciliation. It was a defining moment of choice, trust, and adaptability that could ripple outward, affecting alliances, battles, and the delicate balance of connections within both the Forrester and Spencer families. Meanwhile, Daphne, stepping back into the quiet hallway, reflected on the power of verity and timing, on the unnoticeable vestments that guided mortal connection, on the weight of choosing action over silence, and on the delicate art of allowing love to reclaim its due place without fitting oneself too strongly, knowing that the lowest gestures, like returning a letter, could cock the scales between despair and stopgap, between broken trust and restored closeness. Electra eventually let herself lean into Will, allowing her gashes to fall freely, not just for the backstabbings and heartache but for the release, the acknowledgement of verity, the recovery of love, and as will held her, brooding quiet solace and pledges of unwavering dedication, the fragile, conditional reconnection began to solidify into commodity palpable, commodity enduring.